suburbs of Maryland. Serena Mitchell gazed out of the large kitchen window, the late autumn sun casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns of the neighborhood. On the surface, Serena seemed to have everything: a beautiful house, two children who adored her, and a husband who provided well for their family. But under the surface, something was missing, something that had grown into an overwhelming void over the years. Serena had been married to Jacob Mitchell for over 12 years. Jacob, a successful financial advisor, spent more time at the office than at home. Late nights were the norm, and even when he was home, his mind was somewhere else, buried in business reports or meetings for the next big client. Serena was left to manage the household, raising their two children, Maya and Kyle, both under 10 years old. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the loneliness Serena felt only deepened. It wasn't until Jacob's father, Richard Mitchell, moved in with them that everything changed. Richard was a strong, proud man in his 60s, though the recent loss of his wife had softened him. He had retired from his work as a carpenter, and with nowhere else to go, Jacob had invited him to live in the guest house behind their property. The arrangement seemed ideal at first. Serena took it upon herself to make Richard feel comfortable, preparing meals for him and including him in family activities. But as Jacob's absences grew longer, something unexpected began to develop. The first time Serena noticed the change was on a chilly November evening. Richard had come inside from working on a project in the backyard, his hands still rough and calloused from years of labor. Serena handed him a cup of tea, their fingers brushing slightly. It was an innocent moment, but something about the way their eyes met caused her to pause. There was a tension, a spark that lingered in the air. She quickly dismissed the feeling, shaking her head as if to clear her thoughts. But from that moment on, things were different. Days turned into weeks, and Serena found herself looking forward to Richard's company in ways she never anticipated. His presence was a comfort she had long forgotten, the kind of attention she had once yearned for from Jacob. And it wasn't just the physical closeness. Richard listened to her in a way Jacob hadn't for years. He shared stories about his past, about life before his wife's death, and Serena found herself drawn to him. The two of them began spending more time together. At first, it was innocent enough. Walks in the garden, late-night conversations on the porch after the children had gone to bed. But the connection between them grew deeper, and soon, they were sharing more than just conversations. Serena tried to convince herself that it was harmless, that she was simply lonely, and Richard was filling a void that Jacob had left in her life. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Every glance, every touch seemed to carry weight, an unspoken desire that neither of them dared to acknowledge until one night when the line was crossed. It was a quiet Friday evening in December, and Jacob had left for a business trip that would keep him away for the weekend. The children were asleep, and Serena had made her way to the guest house to bring Richard a plate of dinner. She knocked softly on the door, and when Richard opened it, there was a moment of hesitation in his eyes. The air between them was heavy with something unsaid, something neither could ignore any longer. Serena stepped inside, placing the plate on the table, but before she could turn to leave, Richard reached out and gently took her hand. The touch was electric, sending a shock through her entire body. She looked up at him, and in that moment, the last of her resolve crumbled. Without saying a word, she closed the distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that was both desperate and inevitable. That night, they crossed a line that could never be undone. In the weeks that followed, the affair between Serena and Richard remained their secret, hidden behind the everyday routine of family life. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Serena still managed the household, took care of her children, and smiled when Jacob returned from his trips. But inside, she was a woman divided, torn between the guilt of her actions and the thrill of her newfound connection with Richard. As the days went on, the secrecy weighed heavier on Serena. She knew it couldn't last forever, that eventually something would give. But she couldn't bring herself to end it. She told herself that Jacob would never suspect anything, that he was too consumed by work to notice the subtle changes in her behavior. But Serena had underestimated Jacob. He may have been busy, but he wasn't blind. Serena had no idea that Jacob had started noticing small things, a change in her tone when she spoke to Richard, the way she seemed distracted during their rare moments alone. And then there were the glances, those fleeting, loaded looks between Serena and Richard that Jacob couldn't quite place. At first, he dismissed them as paranoia, a figment of his own imagination. But soon, the doubt began to take root, and once it had, it was impossible to ignore. Jacob didn't say anything, not yet. As the cold winter days pressed on, Serena found herself more and more entangled in her feelings for Richard, unaware that Jacob's suspicions were growing. The storm was coming, and when it hit, it would destroy everything. The cold of winter was giving way to the first hints of spring, but inside the Mitchell household, the tension was becoming unbearable. Serena knew, deep in her heart, that she was walking on the edge of a dangerous cliff. Every stolen moment with Richard felt like a risk that, at any moment, could shatter her world. Their affair had started cautiously. At first, it was small things, a touch of the hand that lingered too long, shared glances when no one else was looking, secret smiles exchanged across the dinner table. But as weeks passed, Serena found herself unable to resist the pull of Richard's presence. He made her feel alive in ways she hadn't felt for years. The more time she spent with him, the more she craved his attention. It wasn't long before they began meeting in secret. Their first rendezvous happened late one evening after the children had gone to bed. Serena had been cleaning the kitchen when Richard appeared in the doorway, his presence both unexpected and undeniable. Without speaking, they found themselves moving toward each other, the unspoken tension finally boiling over. They kissed in the darkened kitchen, the silence of the house amplifying the sound of their rapid breaths. It was a kiss that sealed their fate. But as the affair grew, so did Serena's paranoia. She became acutely aware of everything she said and did, afraid that someone, Jacob, the children, or even the neighbors, might catch a hint of what was going on. Her heart raced whenever her phone buzzed, terrified that Jacob might find a text or call from Richard that would expose their secret. Even Richard seemed to grow more cautious, glancing over his shoulder whenever they met in the garden or shared a quiet moment in the guest house. Despite the growing danger, they couldn't stop. The attraction between them was too strong. Every time Serena resolved to end it, to tell Richard that they couldn't continue, she found herself drawn back to him, their connection too powerful to sever. One late afternoon in March, they took an even bigger risk. Jacob had called to say he'd be home late from work, and Serena, sensing an opportunity, had slipped away to meet Richard at a small, secluded park on the outskirts of town. It was a spot they had discovered by chance, a quiet place hidden by trees where no one from the neighborhood would see them. The air was cool, but Serena's heart pounded as Richard pulled her into his arms. "We need to be more careful," he whispered, his voice low and serious. "Jacob's not an idiot, Serena. He's going to figure this out if we're not smart." "I know," she replied, her voice trembling. "I know, but—" Her words trailed off as she looked up at him, her eyes pleading. She couldn't bring herself to say what she really felt, that she didn't want it to end, that she couldn't lose him now. Richard sighed, his brow furrowing in concern. "We're playing with fire, Serena. If this gets out, if Jacob finds out—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what the consequences could be. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of their decisions pressing down on them. And yet, despite the danger, they kissed again, the fear only fueling the intensity of their desire. Serena drove home that evening with a pit in her stomach.
We are one of the largest and most trusted heating and air conditioning companies in the state of Delaware. If you're here in Delaware or Maryland and you need a new...
She knew Richard was right. They were pushing their luck, and the longer the affair continued, the more likely it was that Jacob would find out. But what could she do? The thought of ending things with Richard felt unbearable. He had become her escape, her refuge from the loneliness that had consumed her for years. Little did she know, Jacob had already begun to suspect. For weeks, Jacob had been watching Serena more closely. At first, it was small things he noticed, the way she seemed more distant when they were together, the fact that she would disappear for hours during the day without explanation. She claimed she was running errands or visiting friends, but something didn't add up. The final straw came when Jacob found a strange receipt in her purse, one for a small hotel in a town an hour away. Serena had never mentioned staying at a hotel, and the date on the receipt lined up with one of the days she had told him she was visiting a friend. Jacob didn't confront her immediately. He knew better than to tip his hand too soon. Instead, he began gathering information, watching Serena's behavior more closely, and quietly following her when she left the house. It didn't take long for him to confirm his worst fears. One afternoon, while Serena thought he was at work, Jacob followed her to a small park outside of town. He stayed back, watching from his car as Serena met someone, a man, beneath the cover of the trees. Even from a distance, he could see the way they embraced, the way their heads tilted toward each other as they kissed. It was all the proof Jacob needed. That night, he lay awake in bed beside Serena, his mind racing. Anger boiled inside him, but he knew he had to be smart about this. Bursting into a rage wouldn't solve anything. No, Jacob needed to plan. He needed to make sure that when he confronted her, he had everything he needed to expose her lies. And more importantly, he needed to find out who the man was. The next morning, Jacob decided to take matters into his own hands. While Serena was out of the house, he went through her things. Hidden in her dresser, he found what he was looking for, a hotel key with a name engraved on it. It wasn't from a hotel he recognized, but it was enough. He now had a physical clue, something he could use to dig deeper. Serena had no idea the noose was tightening around her. She continued her affair with Richard, unaware that her husband was watching her every move. And Jacob wasn't just watching, he was planning. As the days went on, Jacob became increasingly consumed by his need for answers. Who was the man Serena was seeing? How long had it been going on? The questions gnawed at him, fueling a growing rage that he barely contained. But he would wait. He would gather more evidence. And when the time came, he would confront her with the truth. Jacob Mitchell sat in his office late into the night, staring at the hotel key he had found in Serena's dresser. His fingers turned it over and over as his mind replayed every suspicious moment he had observed over the past few months. The affair was no longer just a suspicion. It was a fact, but the full truth had yet to unfold. He needed more than just this key. He needed to know everything. The next morning, as Serena was getting the children ready for school, Jacob made a decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Jacob had never been one to act impulsively, but this situation was different. His heart pounded as he dialed a number from his office phone. The line clicked, and a man's voice answered on the other end. Tom Grayson, a private investigator Jacob had heard about through an old friend. Grayson was known for his discretion, and Jacob was desperate for that discretion now. "Tom Grayson speaking," the voice said, steady and professional. "I need your help," Jacob replied, his voice low, as if he feared Serena might overhear him, though she was upstairs with the children. "It's about my wife. I think she's having an affair. I need you to find out who the man is." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a calm reply. "I can help with that. We'll keep this between us. Meet me this afternoon. I'll send you the details." Jacob agreed, and spent the rest of the morning in a fog of anger and anticipation. By early afternoon, he drove to a small cafe on the edge of town where Grayson was waiting. The private investigator was a man in his late 40s, his graying hair and sharp eyes giving him an air of authority. He listened intently as Jacob explained his suspicions, showing him the hotel key as evidence. Grayson nodded, scribbling notes on a pad of paper. "I'll follow her for a few days," he said. "If she's meeting someone, I'll find out who, but it'll take time." Jacob left the cafe feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. The wheels were in motion now, but the thought of what Grayson might uncover gnawed at him.
Want the fastest working GLP-1? For half the price?
He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the truth, yet he knew it was inevitable. What he didn't know was just how much worse the truth would be. Days passed and Jacob waited, trying to act normal around Serena. She, of course, had no idea that her every move was being tracked. If she had any suspicions of Jacob's behavior, she kept them to herself. Meanwhile, her meetings with Richard continued, though the weight of guilt had begun to press heavily on her heart. One evening, as Serena was helping the children with their homework, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She glanced at it quickly, noting the text from Richard, and a guilty knot formed in her stomach. She quickly put the phone back down, hoping Jacob hadn't noticed. He hadn't, at least not this time, but Serena's nerves were starting to wear thin. It was becoming harder and harder to keep the secret, harder to face Jacob every day without crumbling under the weight of her deceit. Meanwhile, Grayson had been working quietly in the background, following Serena from a distance, tracking her movements. It didn't take long for him to confirm what Jacob had suspected. Serena was meeting a man, regularly, at a rundown hotel outside of town. But what shocked Grayson even more was when he finally got a clear look at the man. It wasn't just anyone. It was Richard, Jacob's father. Grayson, experienced as he was, had seen his fair share of ugly secrets, but even he was taken aback by this discovery. He snapped a few photos for evidence and immediately contacted Jacob, knowing this wasn't just any affair. This was something that could destroy everything. Jacob received the call late one evening after Serena had gone to bed. Grayson's voice on the other end of the line was calm, but his words hit Jacob like a freight train. "Jacob, I found out who your wife's been seeing," Grayson said. Jacob's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is it?" There was a brief pause, as if Grayson was preparing him for the blow. "It's your father." For a moment, Jacob couldn't breathe. His mind reeled, and he had to sit down, the world spinning around him. "My father," he whispered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He had imagined the affair with another man, perhaps a stranger, maybe even someone they knew, but his father? That was something he never could have predicted. "I have pictures to prove it," Grayson continued. "They've been meeting at a hotel outside of town." Jacob's hand trembled as he held the phone. His father. His own father had betrayed him. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for months erupted into a white-hot rage. But even in his fury, Jacob knew he couldn't act immediately. He couldn't just confront Serena or Richard without a plan. No, he needed to be smart about this. "Thank you, Tom," Jacob said, his voice cold. "Send me everything you've got. I'll take it from here." The next few days were a blur for Jacob. Grayson's photos arrived in an envelope, and Jacob spent hours staring at them in disbelief. There, in stark black and white, were images of Serena and Richard, his father, together at the hotel. Every photo was a knife to his heart, each one a reminder of the betrayal that had been festering under his own roof. Jacob knew what he had to do next, but it wouldn't be easy. He couldn't let his emotions get the better of him. The confrontation would come, but not yet. He needed to wait for the right moment, to ensure that when he finally confronted them, there would be no escape from the truth. For now, he watched. He played the part of the unsuspecting husband, going through the motions of family life while quietly seething inside. Serena, oblivious to the storm that was brewing, continued her meetings with Richard, unaware that her world was about to come crashing down. And as for Richard, he carried on with the affair, completely unaware that his own son was preparing to confront him. The tension in the Mitchell household grew thicker with each passing day, though neither Serena nor Richard could see the trap that was closing in on them. Jacob's mind was consumed with thoughts of revenge, but his plan wasn't yet complete. He needed to wait, just a little longer. But when the moment finally came, it would be more explosive than any of them could have imagined. The Mitchell household had grown eerily quiet in the days following Jacob's discovery. To anyone on the outside, things might have seemed normal, a family of four, going about their daily routines in a well-kept suburban home. But behind the closed doors, something dark was brewing. Jacob had spent sleepless nights, haunted by the images Grayson had given him. Every glance at Serena, every word she spoke, felt like a mockery of their marriage. His father, Richard, who had once been his hero, was now the man Jacob despised more than anyone. The anger inside him swelled with every passing day, but he kept it hidden, biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Serena, on the other hand, had begun to notice the subtle changes in Jacob's behavior. He was quieter than usual, his words clipped and cold, but he hadn't confronted her about anything. At first, she thought it was just stress from work. But as days turned into weeks, the distance between them felt deliberate, calculated. A growing sense of dread gnawed at her, but she didn't dare ask what was wrong. She couldn't bear the thought of Jacob knowing the truth. Richard, oblivious to Jacob's suspicions, carried on with the affair, though even he had begun to express doubts. "This can't go on forever," he whispered one afternoon when they met at the park. His eyes, usually so calm and composed, were filled with concern. "We're risking too much, Serena." Serena knew he was right. Every time they met, her heart raced with fear, not just fear of getting caught, but fear of losing everything. "I know," she replied, her voice barely audible, "but I can't lose you, not now." They parted that day with an unspoken understanding. They would be more careful. They would try to pull back. But deep down, both of them knew it was already too late. The affair had gone too far, and the consequences were closing in around them. It was a Friday evening when everything came to a head. Jacob had returned home earlier than expected, finding Serena alone in the kitchen, preparing dinner for the children. The kids were playing in the backyard, their laughter faint through the open window. Serena turned to greet Jacob with a smile, but the look on his face stopped her cold. There was something in his eyes, something dark, unreadable. Her heart skipped a beat, and the familiar knot of fear tightened in her chest. "Jacob?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Is everything okay?" For a moment, Jacob didn't answer. He stood there, his eyes locked on her, the silence stretching between them like a noose. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and cold. "I know, Serena." Serena's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced. Did he know about the affair? Did he know about Richard? She felt the room spin as she struggled to find the right words. "Know what?" she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope Grayson had given him. He tossed it onto the kitchen counter, the sound of it hitting the surface louder than it should have been. "Open it," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. With trembling hands, Serena picked up the envelope and slowly pulled out the contents. As the photos spilled onto the counter, her heart sank. There, in stark black and white, were the images of her and Richard.
What's the deal with these ads promising solar panels for free? Well, it's not true. You can't get solar panels for free.
Their secret meetings, the stolen kisses, everything laid bare before her. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. Jacob, she started, but he cut her off before she could finish. Don't, he hissed, his voice filled with venom. Don't lie to me. I know everything. I've been watching you, Serena. I've been watching both of you. Serena collapsed into a chair, the weight of her guilt crushing her. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean for this to happen. It just happened. Jacob slammed his fist down on the counter, the sound echoing through the room. You didn't mean for this to happen? He shouted. You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around with my father, and you didn't mean for this to happen? The anger that had been simmering inside him for so long finally erupted. He had tried to keep it under control, but seeing Serena's tear-streaked face only fueled the fire. He couldn't stop himself. The betrayal was too great. Serena sobbed, her voice breaking as she tried to explain. I'm sorry, Jacob. I know it was wrong. I know I hurt you, but please don't do anything rash. But it was too late for that. Jacob's mind was already made up. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the house, leaving Serena crying at the kitchen table. She didn't know where he was going, but deep down, she feared the worst. The look in his eyes had been terrifying, and she had no idea what he was capable of. Jacob drove for what felt like hours, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was a whirlwind of rage, betrayal, and a growing need for revenge. He didn't know what he was going to do, but one thing was certain. Someone had to pay for what had happened. Before he realized it, he found himself outside Richard's house. The sight of the familiar home, the place where his father had raised him, filled Jacob with a sickening sense of betrayal. This was the man he had looked up to his whole life, the man who had taught him everything. And now, this same man had stolen his wife, had destroyed his family. Jacob got out of the car, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the gun he had hidden there weeks ago, the one he had bought in a moment of desperation, knowing that this day might come. He approached the house, his footsteps silent on the front porch. He knew where Richard kept the spare key. He had used it countless times before. As he slid the key into the lock and pushed the door open, the house was eerily quiet. Richard was sitting in the living room, his back to the door, reading a book. He didn't hear Jacob enter, didn't see the rage burning in his eyes. Jacob stepped forward, the gun cold and heavy in his hand. Dad, he said, his voice calm and steady. Richard looked up, startled. His eyes widened when he saw the gun in Jacob's hand. Jacob, wait. But Jacob didn't wait. He couldn't wait. The anger, the betrayal, the months of deceit all came crashing down in that moment. Without a second thought, he pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the house, and Richard slumped back in his chair, lifeless. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the carpet. Jacob stood there, frozen, the gun still clutched in his hand. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, Jacob lowered the gun, his heart pounding in his ears. He had done it. He had killed the man who had betrayed him. But instead of feeling relief, all he felt was a cold emptiness. He turned and walked out of the house, leaving the door ajar behind him. The deed was done, but the nightmare was far from over. The next morning, the quiet of the Mitchell household was shattered by a knock at the door. Serena, still reeling from the confrontation with Jacob the night before, opened it to find two police officers standing on her front porch. Their faces were grave, their uniforms stiff and formal. A cold wave of panic washed over her, her heart sinking into her stomach as they spoke. Mrs. Mitchell? One of the officers asked, his voice soft but serious. Yes? Serena's voice trembled, her mind racing. I'm sorry to inform you, but your father-in-law, Richard Mitchell, was found dead in his home early this morning. Serena's world tilted as the words sank in. She felt the blood drain from her face, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. The officers reached out to steady her as she clutched the doorframe for support, her mind spinning in disbelief. Richard was dead. The man she had shared so many secrets with, the man she had betrayed her husband with, was gone. We believe it was a robbery gone wrong, the officer continued, though there was a trace of doubt in his tone. We're still investigating, but we'll need to ask you and your husband a few questions. Serena nodded, though her mind was barely functioning. Of course, I understand. As the officers left, promising to return later, Serena collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with sobs. Her mind was a blur of guilt, fear, and disbelief. She hadn't seen Jacob since he stormed out the night before, and now the horrifying realization dawned on her. He had killed Richard. She didn't know how she knew, but deep down, she was certain. The look in his eyes, the way he had walked out, the quiet fury that had been boiling inside him, it had all led to this. But there was no time to process the guilt, no time to grieve. The police were involved now, and Serena knew they would soon start asking questions. She needed to get ahead of this, to protect herself, to protect her children. A few hours later, the lead detective on the case, John Harris, arrived at the Mitchell home. He was a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, his eyes sharp and observant. He asked Serena about Richard, about their family's relationship with him, and about where Jacob had been the night before. Serena answered carefully, choosing her words with caution. She didn't lie, but she didn't tell the whole truth either. She couldn't. Harris nodded as he listened, but Serena could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't convinced that this was just a robbery gone wrong, and Serena knew why. There were too many unanswered questions, too many inconsistencies. As the interview came to a close, Harris left with a promise to follow up with Jacob as soon as they found him. Serena's heart pounded in her chest as she closed the door behind the detective. She had no idea where Jacob was, but she knew he wouldn't be able to run forever. The guilt, the weight of what he had done, would catch up with him eventually, and when it did, their whole world would collapse. Later that evening, as Serena sat in the quiet of her living room, the phone rang. She jumped, her nerves still raw, and answered it with trembling hands. Serena! Jacob's voice came through the line, cold and distant. Jacob, where are you? Serena's voice was frantic, her mind racing. The police were here. They said Richard's dead. What happened? What did you do? There was a long pause on the other end, and when Jacob finally spoke, his voice was devoid of emotion. I did what had to be done. He betrayed me. You both did. Tears welled up in Serena's eyes. Jacob, you can't just kill someone. Please come home. We can figure this out together. I'll help you. We can make this right. But Jacob's silence told her everything she needed to know. There was no going back. Not now. I'm not coming home, Serena, Jacob said finally. I can't. I'll be gone by the time they find me. I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry, I loved you, but I can't forgive what you did. Before Serena could respond, the line went dead. She stared at the phone in disbelief, the tears falling freely now. Jacob was gone. He had killed Richard, and now he was running. The weight of it all pressed down on her like a crushing wave. Hours later, Jacob's car was found abandoned on the outskirts of town, but there was no sign of him. The police launched a search, but it seemed as though Jacob had vanished. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no trace of him. The once proud and successful man was now a fugitive, a murderer on the run, leaving behind a shattered family and a community in shock. Meanwhile, the investigation into Richard's death continued, and it wasn't long before the police uncovered the truth about the affair. The photos that Grayson had taken, once hidden away, were now evidence in a case that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. Serena's life was laid bare before the public, her infidelity exposed, and the shame that came with it was more than she could bear. She filed for divorce in the months that followed, knowing there was no saving what little remained of her marriage. She moved away from the town she had once called home, taking the children with her, determined to give them a fresh start far away from the horrors of the past. But no matter how far she ran, the memories followed her. The murder of Richard Mitchell remained a stain on the town's history, and Jacob's disappearance became the stuff of local legend. Some said he had fled the country. Others believed he was living under a false identity somewhere far away. But no matter where he was, the truth was clear. Jacob Mitchell had lost everything in his pursuit of revenge. As for Serena, she lived with the guilt of her actions every day. The affair that had once seemed like an escape had led to a nightmare she could never have imagined. And though the pain of Richard's death and Jacob's disappearance haunted her, the worst of it was knowing that, in the end, she had destroyed her family with her own hands. And so the Mitchell family was left in ruins, their lives forever altered by secrets, lies, and the terrible consequences of betrayal.
Do you feel like you might be stuck